How about Danny Jansen, Justin?
Walk-off
Second time in
winner.
4 days. I love this guy.
Yeah.
A lot of has been discussed about clutch genes in sports.
Do you think Danny Jansen's
I
got
think
clutch
he's got
genes?
the gene. Let's bring in our next guest, Garion Thorne of DraftKings. Garion, thanks for coming on. Am I crazy or what? Do we have Danny Jansen as a clutch gene guy?
I don't know. All I know at this point is if you're Aaron Boone, so far this season, you've brought in Wandy Peralta to face Danny Jansen twice in like the 9th inning or later, and twice he's hit a bomb. So keep doing it. I love it, Aaron Boone. That's what I'll say.
Yeah, I still can't believe that John Snyder called him a fat boy. I love that, by the way. I love the animosity between both of these teams. Okay, so last night, another really good outing from Chris Bassett, but another night where the Jays don't give their starting pitcher some run support. What's the issue there with the Jays hitting and good starting pitching when it happens to come together?
I mean, I think the main issue is just the absence of Vladimir Guerrero Jr. I mean, obviously, you can make the case Bo Bichette's been their best bat so far this season, but when you remove Vladdy, this lineup gets sort of thin pretty fast. I'll give Brandon Belt some credit. Since the beginning of May, he's got an OPS well above 1,000. That's definitely helping, but Matt Chapman has cooled off significantly since an incredible start to the season. He's not barreling balls nearly at the same rate he was the first 3-4 weeks of the season. Dalton Varsho has been pretty cold aside from a 2-week stretch to begin May. Whit Merrifield has cooled off recently, and then you've got just little to no production from the catcher position aside from Danny Jansen coming up with some really clutch hits in the past week. But the pairing of Danny Jansen and Alejandro Kirk was supposed to be arguably the best offensive catching duo in baseball, and you just haven't seen it to this point. Cavan Biggio, obviously, Santiago Espinal. There were just some contributions from the bottom of the lineup you were seeing last season. You haven't really gotten outside of Kevin Kiermaier, who's been fantastic, but also needs some days off from time to time. So this is still a lineup that's a work in progress, especially with George Springer not hitting well. But when you remove Vladimir Guerrero Jr., everything obviously gets a little messy.
Gary, when you look at you mentioned the Jays lineup, it's always been very power centric the last few years. And this year, as you mentioned, it's very thin. Is this something now that the front office has to address going forward, or do you see them focusing more on shoring the pitching staff and the bullpen, who has had its ups and downs this year as well?
Yeah, I think they were pretty vocal about wanting to sort of balance the team. I think they were willing to give up some of that like power component we saw the last couple seasons in order to sort of balance the lineup, not just from a hitter type perspective, but a handedness perspective. Teoscar Hernandez is gone. Lourdes Gurriel Jr., who quietly is having an amazing season in the desert in Arizona. Seems like that wrist injury he sustained last year really was the reason that his power was sort of sapped. But, you bring in guys like Dalton Varsho and Brandon Belt, and you're hoping that these guys can not only provide some left-handed element and power to this lineup, but, be as powerful as a Teoscar Hernandez or a Lourdes Gurriel Jr. has been in the past. And so far this season, I think if you go through some of the numbers, like expected home run rate, Matt Chapman, Vladimir Guerrero Jr., those numbers should be higher than they actually are right now. And maybe it's just because they haven't played that many home games. And we know that Rogers Center is, especially with the walls brought in, supposed to play as a very home run friendly park. But, George Springer, his expected weighted on base percentage is higher than his actual weighted on base percentage. There's some things that say normalization is on the horizon and the Jays will start hitting for some power again. But when you're giving significant plate appearances to, Whit Merrifield, who's just not a power hitter at this point in his career, Alejandro Kirk has not tapped into that power we saw prior to the All-Star break in 2022. So there's been some disappointments, definitely. But again, I think Brandon Belt in particular has been hitting a lot better recently, and that's a very promising sign for what this lineup can be.
I think also what the Jays need to do is somehow figure out to get Manoah pitching well again. And before we get into tonight's game, I just want to get your opinion on Manoah. Not great so far, obviously. 5.4 ERA, doesn't look good. Pitching a way that he hasn't pitched, since he's joined the Blue Jays. I just want to throw this one at you. So Kirk is his guy behind the plate. Would switching to Danny Jansen help, or would it be so much more the same with Manoah?
I mean, you could try. At this point, I think you maybe have to start throwing some stuff against the wall, right? The problem with the Blue Jays and their pitching depth in particular is, sometimes if there's a pitcher struggling and maybe he needs some time or to clear his head or anything, like we sort of saw this to some extent with Adam Simber going on the IL. You can use that 15-day IL a little bit creatively, let's say, but the Jays don't have an obvious candidate to step into their rotation and sort of give Alek Manoah a breather or let him, maybe even go find himself a little bit in a minor league rehab start. You don't want to call up Zach Thompson. You don't want to bring up Mitch White, who's looked terrible so far in 2 rehab outings of his own. So I think they're going to have to just keep putting him out there. I know some of the framing stats with Alejandro Kirk are not as good this season, and maybe you can attribute some of the walk rate that we've seen from Alek Manoah to that. But at the end of the day, Manoah was someone who was outperforming his peripheral statistics last season, but not by this margin. Like, he had a 2.3 ERA essentially. ERA estimators said, yeah, you're probably more like a 3.3, 3.5 ERA guy. This has been completely out of line with what I expected. I was expecting some regression, let's be honest. But the fact that his walk rate is as high as it is, the fact that he basically does not know where his pitches are going, we've seen some velocity issues, although that has sort of rectified itself in his last couple starts. I don't know. He might be in his own head. This is definitely the most he's struggled at any professional level. Maybe that's starting to get to him a little bit. So yeah, maybe switching to Danny Jansen and just seeing what happens with that is a good way to go. But the real issue is the Jays' schedule the next month is so difficult. There's not really like a start against the Oakland A's on the horizon where he can maybe get right. There's going to be a lot of good lineups that Alek Manoah has to face.
Cavan Biggio, why is he still in the lineup? And the reason he's only in the big leagues is because of his dad and his last name. Because when I look at his stats, man, what is he doing up with the big team?
Well, Jays fans are calling for his head after that base running,
exactly.
Right? But what do you do here with Biggio?
I mean, again, this is sort of an issue of lack of depth, if I'm being honest.
Yeah.
I mean, Nathan Lucas is on this team. He never plays, but he is. He's on the 26-man roster. And part of this is just some of the Jays, some of the guys they thought would be pushing to make this roster coming out of spring training, an Otto Lopez, for instance, who made a name for Team Canada at the WBC. He's hit terribly so far at AAA in 2023. Addison Barger was a big popular talking point during spring training. Fangraphs had him as the Jays' number 2 overall prospect, way ahead of some other, Baseball Prospectus and MLB Pipeline and other sites like that. He has struggled at AAA and was on the IL in AAA for a little bit as well. It just doesn't seem like there's an obvious guy to call up. Spencer Horowitz is probably someone who, if you asked me who's better right now, Spencer Horowitz or Cavan Biggio, I would pretty soundly say Spencer Horowitz, and he should probably get his opportunity. But the fact of the matter is Horowitz is a DH first base that you can maybe get away with giving some innings to in right field, where at least Cavan Biggio does give you that positional flexibility where he can play second, he can play third, he can play first, he can play both corner outfield spots. That's honestly probably what's keeping him on this roster right now. But I think his hold is tenuous on a roster spot at this point.
Blue Jays Twitter went bananas last night. Even producer Sean McCormick was tweeting out last night about Cavan Biggio. Imagine that. Gary, running out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully we can do this again soon.
Yeah, man. Always fun. All right.